And because of this disproportionate representation, even though the ruling party in Japan doesn't contain an abundance of lawmakers who are particularly friendly to the nuclear lobby, the leadership within that party is very friendly to the nuclear industry. So it is sort of, especially after Fukushima, when everybody is at the peak of wanting to divest from nuclear energy, there's a real sense of minority rule by a very small number of politicians from a very politically significant, but geographically and culturally insignificant part of Japan.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelly Lesher. Today, my guest is Dreux Richard, an investigative reporter and author of a new book, Every Human Intention, Japan in the New Century. In part of this book, he explores the post-Fukushima nuclear regulatory system of Japan and the safety of restarting nuclear reactors threatened by earthquake faults. We just passed the 10th anniversary of the Great East Japan earthquake, which triggered a tsunami that devastated Japan's northeastern region. Reported numbers vary, but around 20,000 people died or remain missing due to these events. But what this tsunami is most known for in the West is the Fukushima Daiichi power plant disaster. The nuclear plant systems detected the earthquake shortly after it happened and automatically shut down or scrammed the reactors, and the emergency diesel generators kicked in to keep the cores cool. All went according to plan. What was unexpected was a 14-meter high wave from the tsunami, which overwhelmed the defensive seawall and flooded the plant. Since the emergency generators were located in the basement of the facility, they were quickly rendered useless, and the Fukushima plant lost power. Although workers tried to restore power any way they could, it didn't happen soon enough. Without power to cool the nuclear fuel, 3 of the reactors overheated and partly melted the cores. There were chemical explosions, and radioactive material began leaking into the atmosphere and the Pacific Ocean. Local areas were evacuated, and exclusion zones were established. With all of that damage, there were no immediate deaths due to the events at Fukushima. Dreux and I began our conversation by discussing his new book, Every Human Intention, and his background reporting on nuclear power plants. Ever the reporter, he sneaks in a question or two for me. How does the first and second half of your book actually connect? Because I saw the first half was very different than the second half.
They don't. Neither stylistically nor rhetorically. And that's been really tricky with reviewers, especially because, the reviews we've been getting have been in the political science category. And those are people who expect you to present an argument and reach a conclusion. And I'm a literary writer by background and training. I'm not a scholar, and I don't write rhetorically. So the book is full of many metaphors and zero arguments. And I think some readers find that difficult to deal with. The first section is sort of a nonfiction novel. The second section is almost like an extended prose poem. It's about gerontology, more or less. And then the third section is, it's more typical investigative journalism. And people find that disorienting, which is okay.
Well, I found it fascinating because it's something that I hadn't thought about in that way. Most of the nuclear energy information that I read and that I gather is very scientific and not from, it's from the IAEA or it's from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and it's not from kind of this high level commission side, which is what your book is talking about.
Yeah, the regulator in Japan wants to be the NRC. I mean, that's their model since Fukushima, absolutely. So, to the extent that you're familiar with the NRC and how they work, there are a lot of comparisons that can be made or that at least Japanese regulators would like to be able to make. But it is distinct as well. And nuclear energy as a political issue in Japan, even before Fukushima, looks like what nuclear energy in the US would look like if every nuclear plant were in California, because of seismic risk. And so you can imagine how intense the conflicts over risk therefore become. And then when the Fukushima disaster does take place, obviously it's like 3 Mile Island times 10 or 20 or 100 or whatever number you would assign to it. And that makes that already volatile situation from a political perspective, much more intense.
Right. Because, I mean, I guess we're getting ahead of ourselves here because people keep comparing it to Chernobyl, but in fact, it's nothing like Chernobyl.
That's a really weird comparison. I'd be curious if I can ask you a question. How is it that people tend to make that comparison in your presence? What's your perception of why that tends to happen?
I think it is because of the news reporting that it's given and the evacuation. So because a large area was evacuated and then declared an unlivable area like Chernobyl was, and then also because it was listed as a level 7 in the scale.
Right, the unplanned release of radiation scale.
Right. I think that's misleading because if Chernobyl and Fukushima are both a level 7, it doesn't make any sense. It's like Fukushima should be a level 7 and Chernobyl should be a level 20. They're only the same level because that's the highest you can go and because of the way that the levels are defined, not because they're equivalent.
Yeah, it's really not fair, and it's increasingly it's in poor taste to beat up on the media for not knowing what to do, for example, with an ENIS rating or what have you. But certainly, if you're interested in maintaining a positive set of feelings toward reporters or towards the press, nuclear energy is not a good subject because it's really tricky, and reporters are on deadlines, and tricky stories like stories from the nuclear industry and tight deadlines don't mix well.
Well, and as a nuclear physicist or someone in the nuclear field, we're to blame. We have these archaic terms that we use. We use rads and rems and grays, and we use all of these scales that don't make any sense to anyone. Our students even confuse them. So it's hard to expect reporters to be able to understand them very quickly.
That's interesting. I don't have a ton of experience with this in the US. I did spend a lot of time reporting on work conditions at Byron Nuclear Generating Station some years ago, but my experience is mostly in Asia. But I would say in Japan, the scientists are usually pretty clearly spoken. And although they use jargon and they expect people to pay attention and listen at length, if you do pay attention and listen at length, what they're saying is eminently comprehensible to the public. The people who tend to do a worse job about that, because I think their training and their background and their profession is more deeply invested in getting people to stop paying attention, are risk management professionals. And they're rarely scientists, right? They're usually probabilistic experts, and their way of approaching things is different.
That's one of the things that I set out to do with the class that I teach. And then, of course, with this podcast is trying to get people more comfortable with nuclear science and with nuclear issues. So it's not as scary as they initially think when they read headlines in the paper. To ask people to look further than just that headline that captures your attention.
Right. I think inaccurate or clumsy risk communication, especially when people become accustomed to it in the media, is the stakes are really high. And so I think we've seen a lot of those chickens coming home to roost during the pandemic, insofar as it's been difficult for people to know who to trust or what it means when different scientists with different backgrounds discuss conflicting risk assessments and projections for the number of infections and deaths and things like that. And the degree to which science and risk modeling become confused and overlap, especially in a field like epidemiology, makes it very difficult for voters to participate intelligently in policy discussions.
Absolutely.
My background in nuclear energy has two very specific sides, and it has to do with the sort of group of people who I spent time with when I was doing the two large projects I did in the industry. And one of those is nuclear reactor operators. I know a ton of nuclear reactor operators. I know their job, I think, probably about as well as any writer or reporter does. And then the other group of people is seismologists, geologists, and other geoscientists who work in seismic hazard assessment. So those are the two long-term projects that I've undertaken in relation to the nuclear industry.
So let me ask you, what is your observation of nuclear operators? Are they a knowledgeable, careful bunch, or are they kind of Homer Simpson characters?
Well, to be fair, Homer Simpson was not a reactor operator, even though he had something that looked like a control room console in front of him. And the types of people who work at nuclear power stations in Illinois are so diverse that you can find Homer Simpson, which may alarm people, but you can also find some really heroic types. My observation of the people working at Exelon plants in Illinois as nuclear reactor operators, especially the unionized reactor operators, so not the senior reactor operators or the shift managers, but the actual reactor operators themselves, the people with their fingers on the buttons, so to speak, tend to be extremely well trained, work very, very well together. I've always been very impressed with them in the way that I think one would be impressed by an extremely safety conscious airline pilot or something of that nature. Once they ascend into management, once they take that senior reactor operator job or that shift manager job, some of them manage to continue to put the safety of themselves, their colleagues in the plant, above all other considerations. Others start shaving margins in the decisions they make in terms of the regulatory impacts of those decisions and the impacts of those decisions on the ability, for example, to finish an outage very quickly. So those things do become more concerning in certain cases. What happened that led me to spend time in Illinois with reactor operators is that there was a loss of offsite power incident that was just like, it was a freak transient. It didn't turn out to be serious or something that really needed to be reported out widely at Byron. But because it was so novel, it resulted in a loss of current for 8 minutes that was sufficient enough to prevent the diesels from kicking in. So they were still on grid power, but they didn't have operability to any safety equipment for 8 minutes. And you have the reactor operator, who of course is a union employee, and he's a member of a strong union, at a plant where there's been a long history of union busting by Exelon, standing there saying to the senior reactor operator and the shift manager, from like minute one, we've lost offsite power, go to the diesels, go to the diesels, go to the diesels. And they hang on for 8 minutes trying to find some other way to deal with it so that the incident will not become a loss of offsite power incident, speaking of incident categories, that is then reported to the NRC and triggers this really specific set of very intense responses. And finally, after 8 minutes, they took his advice and the problem was solved. But those 8 minutes are really they're troubling, right? And so I wound up spending a lot of time with the plant's reactor operators because they reached out to me after deciding they were utterly fed up being in a work culture that permitted that much time to elapse against the better judgment of the reactor operator in order to reduce the regulatory consequences that Exelon could be expected to face, or the regulatory scrutiny, I should say. And what's interesting about that is that the shift manager on that shift was a really, really good reactor operator and a really talented guy who they all liked. And I think if it had been the quintessential company man in charge, they would have just said, well, that guy's a jerk. We know he's a jerk and there's nothing we can do about it. But because they had to watch someone they really respected put the company first as they saw it, they became very concerned and reached out to me. And I spent about a year looking into it with their help.
So let me go back to this incident. The operators wanted to go to diesel power, but the company did not?
The shift manager avoided it for 8 minutes, said, let's just wait and see whether there are any other event transients or other information that allows us to understand what's happening, because they'd never been in this position before. And it wasn't really something that's in the manuals, where you're still barely connected to offsite power, but not enough to keep any important safety equipment operable. Yes, so the reactor operator who was on the reactor, he has a name. His name is Jim Hazen. He's one of the guys who came out of the nuclear Navy, so he's got a very regimented way of running a reactor. And he was pretty young and pretty new at the time and hadn't been subjected to the years of union busting that had gone on at that plant. And so he was very robust in his response. Just his thinking was, we can solve this problem right now, get our safety equipment back by going to diesel power, by going to backup. And there's no reason not to, except to spare the company regulatory scrutiny. Meanwhile, the shift manager who had to pay a price to ascend into management knew how Exelon would react to going to the diesels too quickly and didn't want to do it.
So this kind of takes us into Fukushima and what happened there, because there was a difference between what should have been done during the Fukushima disaster and what the management wanted to be done during the disaster, right?
That's true. Yeah, certainly in terms of the timing and the order of events, especially when it comes to pumping water in a way or that could damage the reactor components permanently, there was a difference between the feelings of the rank and file employees and some of them in particular who've been really heroized for their attempt to get things under control more quickly, and the personnel and leadership offsite who are giving them feedback. I think in the final analysis, and by final analysis, I mean Parliament's official post-mortem of the Fukushima disaster, which is really the basis of their current regulatory system, people came to decide that things that had taken place in a regulatory setting and in a risk mitigation setting before the disaster itself had really sealed the fate of the plant to a much greater degree than those decisions in the moment.
What were some of the regulatory decisions before 2011 even began?
These have been widely discussed, and I'm not a real expert about them, aside from having read the report and knowing some of the people who were involved in authoring it. But to give some major examples, filtered venting wasn't installed. Passive hydrogen recombinators, I don't know if they were never even evaluated or if they were just never installed, but they may never have been seriously evaluated from a risk mitigation perspective. And the big one was they had never really run through accident mitigation scenarios that focused on a total station blackout. In other words, the regulatory agency that was in charge of determining where the risk calculations would go and what they would focus on had determined that the possibility of a prolonged total station blackout was too remote to merit sustained consideration and to determine the priorities for ongoing safety upgrades at the Fukushima plant in particular and at a variety of Japanese nuclear plants in general. So those were revisited after the disaster during Parliament's investigation and were presented as examples of a safety culture that was not sufficiently robust.
And that's important because whenever something happens in a nuclear plant, there's always a procedure. And it's kind of like the military that if something happens, you go to the book and there's a procedure for that. And if there isn't a procedure, then people are kind of at a loss on what exactly you're supposed to do.
Yeah, and the operators write those manuals, so they're written by the people who run the reactor and know how the reactor works. They're not written by people who are unfamiliar with that environment, and they're constantly being updated. It's part of the normal vigilance of a nuclear facility. So it's important to be capacious in your approach to potential risks. But I think if you had talked to the people at that particular regulatory agency before Fukushima and you'd said, what's with this station blackout stuff? Don't you think this is plausible? They would have said, what do you want me to do? Design a car that drives 20 miles an hour top speed and is covered in airbags from like stem to stern? That's not what we do. And that's why, after the disaster, there was also a lot of litigation and a lot of hand-wringing around the question of whether the height of the tsunami could have been adequately predicted, because there were people, including the person who became the vice chairman of the new regulator after Fukushima, who had explicitly on parliamentary panels said that what TEPCO, the utility company that owns the Fukushima plants, is proposing here is far too modest. It's not enough protection. And then, of course, there was also a lot of hand-wringing about like whose bright idea was it to put the diesel generators in the basement in such a low-lying area. These sorts of things all come up. But even when you get into someone like Shimazaki Kunihiko, who was the vice chairman of the regulator for 2 years after the Fukushima disaster, and who had, as early as 2004, stated that TEPCO's tsunami mitigation calculations were probably seriously inadequate. There's still a counter argument to that, which people would make, which is, well, Shimazaki's always telling people that their risk calculations are too low. And so in a polarized ideological environment, it's very easy to see any criticism of the industry's calculations as somehow inexpert or ideologically motivated. The problem is that that's not true 100% of the time. And Shimazaki is someone who's a great example because eventually he came to be seen as a really anti-nuclear figure. But I'm not convinced that if you look at his history of issuing warnings and which warnings they were and how they were issued, that that's an appropriate label for him. He has colleagues, and there are people who do similar things and who are also geoscience experts, who I think that accusation would be fair. It would be fair to attach it to them, but he's not one of them. He's somebody who was mistaken for having some sort of anti-nuclear ideology.
So why don't we go back a little bit? How is nuclear power operated in Japan? Is it run by the state, or is it privately owned?
It's very different now than it was before the disaster and for several years after. So until a few years ago, power plants were operated by regional electricity monopolies. So these are private companies, but there's no competition within the regions of Japan where they operate. And a few years ago, the market was deregulated, which did what deregulation does. In some respect, it allowed smaller players with alternative business models to enter the market. But in other respects, because these regional monopolies had such a head start, it just allowed them to really consolidate their grip on the electricity market. But until Fukushima and for several years afterward, nuclear plants and all power stations were owned by regionally based electricity monopolies. And so when you hear Tokyo Electric Power Company, the whole Kanto region, the region surrounding Tokyo, was exclusively theirs to supply with energy. And among these regional power monopolies, especially the larger ones like TEPCO, were highly diversified, which is to say they were not heavily or exclusively dependent on nuclear energy. Of the major utilities, the only one that was heavily dependent on nuclear energy is the Kansai Electric Power Company, or KEPCO, over in the Osaka, Kyoto region. And, at a given time, I think they generated roughly 51% of their energy from nuclear power plants. But TEPCO was much better diversified. And the only exception that was operating nuclear plants before Fukushima is a company called the Japan Atomic Power Company, which was founded before any of the regional monopolies got into nuclear to test the profitability of constructing and running a nuclear plant in Japan. So they operate as an independent company, but they're still technically owned by the other regional monopolies. And their debts are guaranteed by the other regional monopolies, and those monopolies put executives on their board, so they exist at arm's length from them. They're exclusively a nuclear power generating company, so they wholesale nuclear energy from their nuclear reactors to these regional monopolies. And they're pretty small in comparison with the regional monopolies because they only do one thing.
Were they successful in creating new reactors or new ways to generate electricity in that role?
Yeah, obviously, other utilities, all the regional monopolies adopted nuclear energy after JAPCO, or everybody calls them Genden, which just means nuclear energy in Japan. So after Genden trialed those technologies, they were widely adopted. There were a number of innovative things they did before other Japanese utility companies were willing to do them. They were supposed to build the first APWRs. I think for a long time, they were the only Japanese nuclear company that had completed a reactor refueling outage in a sort of American timeframe. Normally in Japan, they take like 90 days. And partly that's for the benefit of the economies surrounding the plants because you get an influx of workers and so forth. But, Genden proved that it could be done more quickly even in Japan. And usually when a Japanese nuclear company or a Japanese electricity company needs to go abroad to help other countries with nuclear infrastructure development, it's usually Genden that does it. So they're seen as sort of an agile, pioneering kind of company. But because they're a small company and because they're not diversified, they're probably one of the less prestigious employers in Japan's energy sector. And that results in a very different kind of work culture.
I was going to ask you about the safety culture. It's really important in nuclear power to have a strong safety culture. Did Genden have a better safety culture than the other big companies?
I think they had a higher number of employees who were in touch with the importance of maintaining a robust safety culture. Whether that means their safety culture was better or not depends on which anecdote you look at. So to argue against the notion that they had a strong safety culture, they had, as much of the book gets into, an enormous earthquake fault very, very close to a highly vulnerable reactor, and just spent decades telling bald-faced lies about it. Meanwhile, every geoscientist in Japan knew they were lying, and they continued to do it, and the regulator let them get away with it. On the other hand, this is the same company that took a suggestion from a prefectural politician, i.e. a local politician, about the tsunami vulnerabilities at one of their plants, not far from the Fukushima plant, immediately took it all the way up to the CEO and the chairman and the board and said, there's this guy in Ibaraki Prefecture who'd like us to look at this again. Voluntarily, without any regulatory intervention, looked at it again and decided, well, okay, we are going to increase our tsunami countermeasures. And as a result of this decision, and as a result of carrying it out much faster than most companies would make that kind of expenditure, they had like a 99% operable seawall and a variety of tsunami countermeasures, I want to say 2 or 3 days before the Fukushima disaster. And if that project had been delayed, or if they hadn't carried it out, the 2 reactors at that plant would have been in serious trouble, because they did lose backup power during the tsunami, and they were inundated, but not to a degree that threatened the plant because of those countermeasures. Now, why did they do that? First of all, they're a small company with a democratic management style, because they're such a small company, and you can take something from a local politician straight up the chain. You couldn't do that at the large monopolies in the Kansai area or in the Tokyo area. And I think the other thing is their workers primarily reside in communities surrounding nuclear power plants. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they love those communities or want to take care of them, but it does mean that they know what happens when those communities don't want those plants around anymore, and how many legal and regulatory hurdles come up in Japan. And there are a lot, and this is specific to Japan, when the mayor or the governor isn't interested in hosting your facility anymore. Other companies became aware of this after Fukushima, when other prefectures started to flex their muscles. But probably Genden was the only company that had been through this stuff with local governments before the disaster because of where their plants were located. And as a result, I think they were much more willing to take seriously the need to be responsive to local government, lest the local government turn around and say, well, you're not taking our suggestions, so we're tired of having you around and we want you to decommission in 10 or 15 years or something.
Wow. And it is a big deal to have the community on your side. And if you have workers that live and work in the community, and you have managers that live and work in the community, then you seem to have a higher acceptance in the community.
Yeah, and in Japan, there had been a series of belated disclosures or non-disclosures about everything from radiation releases to equipment breakdowns at nuclear plants in Fukui Prefecture, where they have 15 reactors. It's by far the densest concentration in Japan. And as a result of these repeated incidents and the fact that they weren't disclosed or weren't disclosed promptly, that prefecture had very gradually developed a legal precedent, which would come to apply across Japan, where it was very difficult to obtain legal permission to operate reactors without the permission of the city or town where they're located and Fukui's prefectural government. So Genden knew about this because that's where their plants are, and because their plants are in a pretty fair-sized city. The other utility in that prefecture, most of their plants are in very small communities. So those are much easier communities to use an ugly word, capture, fiscally or culturally or economically. Whereas if Genden wanted to continue running their plants, they needed the mayor of a city of 68,000 and the governor of the entire prefecture on their side. So they would be a lot less likely to ignore local politicians' needs.
Is this large density of reactors, is that what is called the Japan's Atomic Broadway?
Yeah.
I love that title. I don't know why.
I don't know if I can take credit for it. It's Genpatsu Ginza, and Ginza means like high street. And so I've usually seen it rendered as nuclear high street, but that seemed very British to me. So
I like Broadway.
Had to find another way to say it. Yes, that is the southern half. So Fukui Prefecture is on the opposite side of Japan from Tokyo. It's geographically nowhere close, and it's culturally very different. It's the third least populous prefecture. I think the whole prefecture has 750,000 people or thereabouts. And it's a prefecture composed of two very culturally distinct regions that have been mashed together. And the southern half of the prefecture, which is much smaller, it's basically just the coastline of a single bay, is where all of the reactors are located. So it's not even a prefecture with 15 reactors. It's the very small southern half of one prefecture and a very sparsely populated one. But the other thing to know about Fukui Prefecture is that Japan has this incredible disparity in voter representation because voting districts were drawn when the population of the country was very rural. And Fukui is the greatest beneficiary of this imbalance. So one vote in Fukui equals about 3 votes in the Tokyo area. And because of this disproportionate representation, even though the ruling party in Japan doesn't contain an abundance of lawmakers who are particularly friendly to the nuclear lobby, the leadership within that party is very friendly to the nuclear industry. So it is sort of, especially after Fukushima, when everybody is at the peak of wanting to divest from nuclear energy, there's a real sense of minority rule by a very small number of politicians from a very politically significant, but geographically and culturally insignificant part of Japan.
Oh, that's interesting. So how much of Japan's power before Fukushima was supplied by nuclear energy?
Roughly a third, a little less than a third.
So after Fukushima, when the nuclear fleet was halted, that was a significant amount of power that was stopped.
Yeah, it was stopped gradually. So it wasn't like an instant nationwide shutdown order was issued. Essentially, when reactors had to stop for various reasons afterwards, as they do, I mean, routinely in many cases, they simply weren't allowed to restart, or it was understood that they would not restart because Parliament had determined that the regulations that permitted the Fukushima disaster to occur were not adequate to continuing to operate nuclear plants. Therefore, the nuclear industry should do the polite thing and decline to restart their reactors until new regulations were in place and they could prove that they had conformed to those new regulations.
Did the nuclear industry politely decline to restart, or were they forced to politely decline to restart?
No, there was no real attempt on the behalf of any of the electricity monopolies to violate what was in the air at that time, about not restarting prematurely. Later on, there were particular, to give an example, courts have ruled against nuclear companies in Japan, and increasingly they do. And the nuclear companies have said, well, we're going to restart anyway. So there's belligerence, but there was no real belligerence at that time. Everybody agreed, I think, that was the appropriate approach. And furthermore, Japan is a country where major institutions, be they corporate or public, do their best to get along. It's a relational, discretional, administrative sociology there, which means institutions value their relationships with one another, and they value working together to maintain their ability to make judgments in the way and at the time that they want to make them for themselves, which on the flip side means there's not a lot of accountability or transparency. Japanese society isn't, and especially administrative society, is not big on public transparency or public accountability.
Reading in your book, it doesn't sound like it was easy to come up with the regulations that the industry was going to follow.
Yeah, the big omission and the big problem, and I think this is something that's easiest to discuss in comparison with the US, is there are no operating licenses for nuclear facilities in Japan. They don't have to hold operating licenses. They have to obtain construction licenses. And then legally speaking, and this is sort of a crude summary, but it's true. I mean, I would say this even to someone very knowledgeable. Once you have the construction permission, you don't have to prove that your plant is really fit to operate in the future. It's mostly self-regulation at that point.
Okay, that is very odd because in the US, you have to get an extension and then you have to prove that you can continue to operate.
Oh, it's constant. It's constant in the US. And that's true of pretty much every European regulatory regime that I'm familiar with. And it extends to personnel. You're constantly retraining your licensed personnel. And if they flunk, You got to take them out of that licensed position until they can prove that they meet the NRC standards. So it is unusual. It's very unusual. And it wasn't addressed after Fukushima. So the conclusion of the parliamentary investigation was this was the regulator's fault in concert with the people at the utilities who they worked on risk mitigation with. But they didn't really, in any meaningful way, overhaul nuclear safety laws. What they did was say the old regulatory agencies will have to be sunset immediately and replaced with a new agency operating under a new set of principles with a strong safety culture mandate. But the laws didn't change. And this issue of not needing an operating license didn't change. And what was determined instead was that with new leadership and a new mandate for safety culture, the new regulatory agency would be permitted to impose new construction standards, i.e., rather than create a system of operating licenses, they would maintain their system of construction licenses, and they would just set new construction standards, and the utilities would have to meet those standards before they could restart their plants. And this was done because it seemed legally difficult and politically difficult to change the system that had issued those construction licenses, because the utilities might fight it. And the utilities' political allies might fight it and say, hey, we hold legal permission to operate our plants. We're already declining to do so at your behest. And now you're telling us you're just going to unilaterally, with no legal basis for doing so, revoke that permission? At this point, we've had enough. So the simpler solution was new agency, new leadership, same laws, and they will get a one-time opportunity over the course of the next several years, and this process is still ongoing, to revise construction standards and force existing nuclear stations to conform to those construction standards before they can restart.
Okay, so this is then not just the reactors that are being built now for the future, but the reactors that are already in operation have to conform to the new construction standards?
Right, exactly. And the idea was we will compel existing reactors to conform to post-Fukushima construction standards before they can restart. So the ones that are already back in operation, with some exceptions like they have X number of years to make anti-terrorism upgrades and so forth, for the most part, they're now in the clear. But there are many that still haven't restarted and that are trying to restart. So they're still undergoing that form of review, which they call conformity review, i.e. they're being reviewed for conformity to new construction standards enacted after Fukushima. But they do not need to hold operating licenses. That still hasn't happened.
Okay, so all of this revolves around fault lines, right? It's a big topic of how close you are to a fault line, how big the fault line is, if it's active or inactive. If I read that correctly, there's a lot of discussion over if there's going to be an earthquake or not near your plant.
Yeah, that was by far the most important debate for several years after Fukushima, and the one that even today determined the shape of nuclear regulation in Japan after Fukushima for a couple of reasons. And the primary one is that without any real legislative overhauls, there aren't a lot of opportunities for Japanese regulators, in light of the fact that there are no operating licenses involved, to find that a nuclear plant is so far out of regulatory compliance that it can't operate, either for the time being or in the future. And so really, the only seismic risk regulation that permits nuclear regulators in Japan to find that a plant should not be allowed to operate for now or into the foreseeable future is the possibility of a displacement, i.e. faulting, movement of a fault, that is greater than zero directly underneath either a reactor building or a piece of equipment in the plant or a plant component that is considered essential to the safety of the reactor building. So the fault has to be directly underneath, and there has to be a risk that it will displace. And that the threshold there, that risk is determined by finding out where possible, and unfortunately, as regulators learned, that's not so easy, whether it has moved in the last 120,000 to 130,000 years.
I'm not a geologist, so I don't know how hard or easy that would be.
So the important things to know about that are it does define it does sit on the boundary of an important period in the history of the Earth, right? So there are other indicators that correspond to it because a lot was changing there in terms of glaciation and so forth. But radiocarbon dating only goes to 50,000 years. So you have lost your best and most reliable tool. And before Fukushima, that was the threshold, 50,000. And then after Fukushima, it was determined I'm mixing up my dates. Until I think 2006, if I'm right, that was the threshold. And then because of an earthquake at a Japanese nuclear plant that had like more than triple the expected amount of ground motion, in 2007, those regulations were tightened. And as a result, you now had this broader threshold that introduces more methodological problems. And then those problems weren't immediately an issue in 2007 because there was just a lot of cooperation between the utilities and the regulators. After Fukushima, when the question of forcing dangerous plants not to operate became very politically and socially and administratively important and important to safety, all of a sudden there's renewed attention to this issue of whether there are active faults under nuclear plants because it's the only tool that this new agency has from a legal perspective to carry out its mission of regulating more strictly.
Is there an active fault underneath the Fukushima plants?
No. Well, here's the honest answer to that question. I've not even looked at it, and I don't even know if anybody has, because the causes of that disaster were clearly, a tsunami caused by an earthquake offshore. So it would be kind of irrelevant to the risk profile of that plant. I think the answer is there very well may have been. Would it have been a large one, and would it have been directly underneath the reactor or safety critical equipment? That's an open question. But if you're looking for a small fault that moved recently within the vicinity of the plant, probably a pretty good likelihood you could find one.
I asked just because would these new regulations have prevented a Fukushima disaster? Because that's why they're making these regulations. And so then, of course, you're going to ask, would it have prevented anything?
Well, I think the argument there would be that a regulatory environment where seismic risks could be addressed in the way that this active fault regulation attempted to model would have prevented Fukushima. Because the problem in the case of Fukushima was that tsunami risk calculations were seen as so malleable and so easy to litigate by the engineers working for TEPCO. And TEPCO employs a lot of engineers. They're very good engineers. And if they turn their collective efforts toward convincing the regulator that tsunami mitigation thresholds could be lowered, then they're going to win that argument. In the same way that when that big earthquake happened in 2007 at another TEPCO plant in another part of the country, what was found was that TEPCO's engineers had bullied the regulator into lowering the ground motion thresholds. And so if you want to deal with that issue, if you want to create a regulatory system that isn't beholden to the engineering arguments of the utility companies, the place where you have to start after the Fukushima disaster is with the risk of a fault erupting underneath a nuclear plant, because that's the only place where sufficient legal leverage exists.
Okay. Because the reactor shut down just fine after the earthquake. There were no issues there. You're right. The tsunami had the impact.
Yes, that's right. It's simply the result of the regulatory system lacking other means to identify and idle or ultimately decommission very risky reactors. I think if there had been a way to approach, either legally or scientifically speaking, the tsunami issue without winding up in an endless and very intangible set of arguments with the utility company's engineers, I'm sure that the regulators would have headed in that direction. But really the only path available to them in order to manifest the kind of robust safety culture, which was everybody at the agency had been instructed by politicians in the government, supposed to be the strictest in the world, that if that's where you're going, the only way to get there, legally speaking, after Fukushima, is by addressing the active fault issue. That's, I think you could say that's lamentable. You could say, yeah, they should have just changed the system to issue operating licenses, or they should have done these other things that they didn't do. But when the new leadership of the regulator came in after Fukushima, they took a look at what was on their desks and said, only one of these things can move the needle now.
That makes sense. How many reactors have they found that are on active fault lines? Or what percentage of them? Because you said 31% of power, but how many reactors are there?
There were 54 before running before the Fukushima disaster. Let's see. So that's one. I think ultimately they convicted like 4 reactors of operating above active faults. And then there are concerns at others that haven't been formally saddled with that kind of finding in other parts of the country. So I would say 6 or 7 would be generally regarded by geoscientists at this point as either being constructed above active faults or the issue being cloudy enough that it merits attention within that particular scientific context.
Are the power companies going to remediate this, or are they just going to shut the reactors off? It's too expensive.
So none of them are just going to shut the reactors off. I mean, they'll fight till the bitter end not to do that. For a wide variety of reasons, it's possible for them to litigate the issue. Most scientists would agree that you can't remediate the risk of a fault displacement occurring directly beneath a reactor or its most important components. It's not that there are no engineers who are willing to say that you can mitigate that. It's that it's a small enough minority of people who are willing to say that politically speaking and within the world of academic expertise, it's not a statement you can really get away with long enough to affect the regulatory discussion. So it's a non-starter from a regulatory perspective. If the ground underneath the reactor is going to fracture, you can't operate that reactor.
How is this impacting reactors that are scheduled to be built?
So there's not a ton of new reactor construction scheduled in Japan in a way that looks realistic. I don't keep track of the churn of this because it's so constant and it involves so many of these different little companies that are constantly popping up and then being whacked down. I think OMA is still looking like it might go forward, and I don't know what the geological hazards are like at that site. I don't think it's been one of the primary concerns there. But yeah, I would say that active fault findings did eliminate or greatly reduce the likelihood of new reactor construction at every site that already had reactors and was looking to build more. So Gendem wanted to build the nation's first APWRs at the Tsuruga site. That has become much more difficult because of the active fault finding at the newer of the 2 reactors that are already there. TEPCO wanted to build more reactors at the Higashidori site, and that's not going to happen. So it's had a major impact on the likelihood of future reactor construction.
I remember reading somewhere that there was an impact on the Japanese economy because of turning off the nuclear reactors. Is that true? Did they experience brownouts, or did they experience any sort of downturn in their economy because of this?
Well, initially after the disaster, there was a lot of chaos for the grid on a national level. That settled down. I mean, I think the long-term effect on the economy was importation of fossil fuels. And it's a really complicated question what that does to Japan's economy, because who's in a really good position to do that and make money from it, especially when the price of those fuels may be low, at a low point in the prices of oil futures, the large electricity monopolies. So they actually did quite well, many of them, while that was going on. Is there a loss of efficiency at a national level in competition with other countries? You could say so, but I think, as you probably know, a large part of what makes nuclear energy efficient or not are the social circumstances under which you run it. So if you have a really, really strict regulatory regime, and that regulatory regime is asking you to invest in a lot of expensive safety upgrades all the time, and those safety upgrades are not narrowly targeted, they're really broad, and you also have a very hostile social and political environment that is leading to much more political scrutiny, and these factors sort of come together in a certain way, the cost efficiency of nuclear energy really can go down in a way that's unrelated to the actual method of generating power. So depending on those factors, you can make an argument that not being able to run as many nuclear plants as they once did is really harmful to Japan's global energy competitiveness. But you could also make the argument that at this stage in the history of nuclear energy in Japan, it would be very expensive to run the plants anyway, based on the way that they're regulated and based on the amount of political scrutiny involved.
I've seen that the Japanese people really came out against nuclear energy after the Fukushima disaster. Has that sentiment changed over the years?
It's softened to an extent, I would say, if you look at the poll numbers, and I never know how much to trust them in Japan because turnout is such a funny thing, and they tend to vote in a very different way than people in Western democracies. But in certain areas, it's still very pronounced. For example, if not for a really serious public sordid infidelity scandal in Niigata Prefecture, I don't think TEPCO would have had any chance over the long run of restarting their nuclear reactors there. And that's because that prefecture has a specific kind of prefectural politics that's very regional. And most of the regions that don't host the plants see them as an undue burden that only enriches the region that does host the plants. So things like this happen. So there is still a really marked resistance to widespread nuclear plants in Japan, even if it isn't today quite what it was after the disaster.
What's happening to the Fukushima area? Are people being allowed back in? What does the country think about the people in that area?
That is such a terrible can of worms for anybody to think about or get into, because there's a lot of rehabilitation of that area, but it's subject to so much propaganda and so much misrepresentation by a pretty docile media in Japan that it's really difficult to know what's true. And then there are things that make it very difficult to trust any positive messaging around that remediation of that area. Like, they don't, Japan's government refuses to actually track in any meaningful, accurate way how many people displaced by that disaster and the radioactivity released by that disaster are still itinerant, still don't have a place to go. And so I think it's really difficult, really, really difficult to know. And there have been a lot of books written about it by people on both sides of the ideological spectrum. And it's sort of I would say it's an ideological war zone. The question of what that part of the country looks like now, whether it's right or fair to ask people to go back there, and so forth. It's tough to get good information, and it's tough to know who to trust.
Do you have a sense of how the citizens in other prefectures are treating the displaced?
Most people who have been displaced by that wound up in cities, particularly in the greater Tokyo area, living really difficult lives. There's a lot of mental illness, a lot of suicide, a lot of being taken advantage of by employers that most people wouldn't want to work for, a lot of really contingent living based on part-time work. So I think the people who are still displaced, their lives look pretty tragic. And I do think they've become, in some ways, a pretty durable underclass. And being affected by an unplanned release of radiation in Japan comes with a social stigma that goes all the way back to the atomic bombing. And that social stigma is magnified by being displaced. And it's magnified by the fact that that region, the Tohoku region, is historically a really pastoral, agricultural, also fishing heavy region, so it engages in the types of labor that aren't valued in other parts of Japan. And so people from that region have always been discriminated against. So yeah, they have a really hard time. Those are, by and large, those are not happy stories.
You touched on the connection that I was interested in, which was, are they kind of the modern hibakusha?
Some of those individuals have labeled themselves that way and feel pretty fierce about doing it. Whether it's appropriate depends on who you talk to, and it's very sensitive, obviously, because it's a term that has a very particular and historically sensitive context. I think it's a fair comparison for people who have been affected by the Fukushima disaster to decide that they want to make, because bomb-affected person to me on a metaphorical level means that the cruelty and indifference of the political system you live in, either nationally or globally, reaches a level where it affects you as if it's a force majeure event, as if someone has dropped a bomb on your city. And I think in light of the fact that everybody can agree that the nuclear regulatory system was woefully inadequate when it came to the risks at the Fukushima reactors, and that was the primary cause of the disaster, or the main aggravating factor that led to the disaster, they have a right to feel that the indifference of politicians and corporate leaders in Tokyo toward their lives grew to such an extent that it drove them from their homes. I think that's a fair assessment for them to make.
Are they getting any sort of support from the government now?
Over time, that has really diminished. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to have a conversation about that region that's not really ideologically charged, because to oversimplify it, the government's position in many cases is, okay, you can go back to these places now. So what are we really paying you for? In what way should we continue to support you? And, these are problems of radiation release always arise at these really strange questions, like how far should the radius be? As in, if you're within 20 kilometers, you deserve benefits. If you're at 20.1 kilometers, you don't. Or, if you're 8 months removed from this, you deserve money from the government. If you're 8 months in a day, you don't. And so anytime there's this kind of catastrophe, and it's not limited to nuclear catastrophes, but they have a way of bringing out this discussion that may be really unique, that leads to a lot of very strange changes in the human geography of the region, because time and distance come to take on very different meanings when people are really concerned about their safety from invisible threats to their health.
And to make the comparison to the world we live in now, which is your assessment of risk for going out into the world where COVID is, may be different than my assessment of risk for going out into the world with COVID. We all have a different risk assessment when it comes to our health today.
Yeah, and in a similar respect, it's not a great moment and it's not a great context for having very little faith in the responsiveness of your democratic institutions to your needs, your safety, and your will as a voter. And I think we've certainly seen that. I certainly saw that in a really dramatic way in Japan after the Fukushima disaster, which is to say, for quite a while after the disaster, nuclear company executives, the engineers who worked for them, regulators, politicians, everybody was pretty clear about what they wanted to do. They all wanted to reform the nuclear industry and the way it was regulated, and they wanted to do it in a pretty similar way. And that's very rare. That's a very rare political occurrence in Japanese society. And it was a remarkable thing to witness. And then it all fell apart and amounted to nothing. I mean, it didn't fall apart instantly, but given the level of political consensus about where the risks were and what needed to be done about them, the amount that has since been accomplished is so small that the real lesson of those years feels like, be careful what you believe you're capable of, because you might not be, even when everybody wants to do it. And one can feel a really similar way about what's going on in respect to risk communication and management and scientific consensus surrounding the COVID pandemic. Scientists are doing their best. Some of them are better risk communicators than others, but the message doesn't always get through in a clear way when the media picks it up or when politicians try to take advantage of it. And we find ourselves, despite the fact that we all have a shared interest in a solution, I think we can all visualize in a very similar way. The outcome is really catastrophic. And, I lived in New Zealand from 2016 to 2019, late 2019. So until a few months before the pandemic hit. And that's obviously a country that has approached this in a very different way and has much lower infection numbers. So it feels dramatic for me, or it feels dramatized in my life that, boy, there are a lot of different ways that things can go when everybody faces the same problem and wants to solve it at the same time.
So after Fukushima hit, after the tsunami hit, the earthquake, then the tsunami, you said that you were living in Japan at the time. The US media pretty much ignored all of the lives lost during the tsunami in Japan and focused more or less on Fukushima. What was the media reporting like in Japan? Was it focused in the same way that it was elsewhere in the world?
I think there's been a lot of focus on humanizing the individual people who died or who are missing, and many of whom remain missing. The official toll from the tsunami was, I think it stands at something like 16,000 right now. What I remember about the coverage of the disaster at the reactors was that people connected to the nuclear industry were very sanguine about the potential consequences before the explosions occurred. And if you talk to people in Japan's nuclear industry, they will say that they all sat there in horror watching this thing being explained away in a disingenuous manner, and meanwhile knowing this is going to be really serious. But the thing about the aftermath of the disaster and the way that people's lives and the preciousness of life has been covered in the media is that there's just a tremendous amount of disagreement. And really, I would say most of the arguments are in pretty bad faith and pretty nakedly ideological about the long-term mental and physical health effects of the release of radiation and the displacement of people. So at what point does we need to support people who are displaced turn into how long are these people going to continue to take advantage of the government and shouldn't they go home? And that's not happening without exception, but that is a change in narrative you've seen among certain more politically conservative groups in Japan, which is because they were the ones who were most enthusiastic about supporting the region at the time of the disaster. And then conversely, as time went on, came to see it as sort of a liberally political opportunity, what was being done to humanize the people who remained displaced. So that's weird. And the thing that has been strangest of all is watching the debate about whether there has been any increased risk of thyroid cancers among children who were exposed after the disaster. And the UN, I think on the 10th anniversary of Fukushima, if I'm not mistaken, and if not, the day before or the day after, issued a report saying that there's been zero increase in the incidence of thyroid cancers. That's something that Japan's public health authorities, that's a conclusion they'd also reached. But I don't think the Japanese people believe that, and I don't think they trust it. And I think they see it as an example of powers abstracted from themselves whose motives they don't trust, taking advantage of the inherently unknowable nature of the epidemiology attached to excess exposure to radiation, which isn't huge, which is relatively mild in the grand scheme of things. So I think it's become a real political fault line for people when it comes to thinking about nuclear energy, how global and national public health authorities have handled the thyroid health of children who are living in the disaster area.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to Dreux, who taught me so much about Japan and their nuclear industry. I hope you learned something too. And as always, thank you to Lexi Weghorn for all of her help with this podcast. You can access more information from our website, mynuclearlife.com. For bonus content, you can find us on Patreon, and make sure to share us with a friend. Until next time, I'm Shelly Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.